Since the Industrial Revolution, environmental pollution as we know it today has been on the rise. However, it was only since the publishing of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring in 1962 that modern environmentalism was born. The book questioned the overuse of DDT and pesticides, and their effect on humans and ecology. It was from here that people began to wonder how human actions affected the environment. Soon enough, groups like the Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth were promoting environmental activism. In the early 70s, the Chipko movement, led by Mohandas Gandhi, coined the term tree hugging, where followers literally hugged trees to stop deforestation. With the creation of Earth Day in 1970, people began to feel an obligation to protect the ecosystems on which humans thrive. By the mid-70s, environmental ethics joined with anti-war ideologies, and Greenpeace was born. The founding members of Greenpeace were brought together by the announcement of an underground nuclear test in the tectonically unstable Alaskan island of Amchitka. Plans had been made by the United States to detonate a 1-megaton bomb codenamed Milroy on October 2, 1969, as part of the nuclear weapons testing program. Environmentalists predicted that such a detonation would cause earthquakes and tsunamis, disrupting ecosystems across Asia and North America. The environmental group SPEC, standing for Scientific Pollution and Environmental Control Society, organized a protest blockading the border entrance to Blaine, Washington on October 1, 1969. In attendance, brandishing signs which read, "Don't Make a Wave," were Bob and Zoe Hunter, Irving Stowe, and others who would eventually form the core of Greenpeace. That night, Milroy was detonated 4,000 feet below the surface of Amchitka, creating a surface crater 3 kilometers in diameter, and causing a seismic wave registering 6.9 on the Richter scale. In November of 1969, the U.S. announced that Milroy was simply a calibration test for Canakin, a larger 5-megaton nuclear bomb, almost 400 times larger than that of Hiroshima. Irving Stowe, an attendee of the Milroy protest, formed a group under the name Don't Make a Wave, borrowing the phrase made during the SPEC protests. He would recruit Bob Hunter, Ben Metcalf, Bill Darnell, Terry Simmons, and Mary Boland, all of who would become the core founders of Greenpeace. Mary Boland then came up with the idea to sail a boat from Vancouver into the nuclear testing zone, thereby preventing the blast from occurring. After attending a meeting discussing the plan, Irving Stowe flashed the peace sign, saying peace. Bill Darnell replied with, "Make it a green piece." While the Don't Make a Wave committee had a plan, they had no money to execute, so they held a benefit concert featuring Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, and Phil Oakes. By the end of October of 1970, the organization had raised $23,000 and were ready for their trip to Alaska. John Cormack, a keen supporter of the Don't Make a Wave committee, had volunteered his boat, the Phyllis Cormack, for the mission. After renaming the boat the Greenpeace, the crew set out on October 15, 1971. But it was soon evident that the mission would not be successful. Before the crew had even reached the Alaskan boundary, they were turned around by a U.S. customs ship. The Canakin was detonated on November 6, 1971, creating a new lake on Amchitka, 1 mile wide, and also killing approximately 1,300 sea otters. The explosion registered 7.0 on the Richter scale, and, while it did not trigger earthquakes and tsunamis as predicted, abnormal seismic activity lasted for several weeks following the detonation. Although the mission failed to stop the detonation of the Canakin, the U.S. announced that it had cancelled plans for further testing on the island. Amchitka would later be deemed a bird sanctuary. Additionally, the trip sparked a lot of public interest. Media coverage was international for this small group of protesters from Vancouver who had tried to stop the detonation of a nuclear bomb in the face of adversity. The attention garnered by the group would later be the most successful outcome of the Amchitka voyage, paving the road to the Greenpeace that exists today, an environmentalist organization with offices in more than 40 countries and over 2.9 million members worldwide. Following the trip to Amchitka, Greenpeace continued to focus on preventing nuclear testing with protests against French atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. David McTaggart, a New Zealand businessman, caught wind of the anti-nuclear protests Greenpeace was initiating with Amchitka, and volunteered his boat, renamed Greenpeace 3, for an attempt similar to the Kaneken mission aimed at disrupting French nuclear testing on the French Polynesian island of Moruroa Atoll. The French Navy made attempts to stop the protest, including an assault on McTaggart. However, one of the crew members of Greenpeace 3 filmed the incident and made it public. Following the incident, the French government abandoned the plans for atmospheric testing, instead focusing on underground testing. While Irving Stowe didn't want to stray from preventing nuclear testing, a large number of Greenpeace employees felt restricted in simply protesting for one environmental issue. So they independently began Project Ahab, a campaign to disrupt whaling. When Stowe died in 1975 due to pancreatic cancer, the Phyllis Cormac was rededicated to the anti-whaling campaign along the Californian coast. Greenpeace's strategy was especially effective. They would position their boats between the whalers and the whales, forcing, in a somewhat self-deprecating manner, the whalers to shoot harpoons through protesters. Media coverage of such practices would gain even more international attention, further spreading the message of environmental activism Greenpeace was beginning to share. In 1978, Greenpeace would buy and launch the Rainbow Warrior, a 130-foot fishing trawler. Initially deployed to counter Icelandic whaling, the crew of the Rainbow Warrior would eventually go on to engage in direct action against the dumping of toxic waste directly into the ocean, the Orkney Island seal hunt, and further nuclear testing in the Pacific. In 1985, while on a mission to stop underground testing in the previously mentioned Moruroa Atoll, the Rainbow Warrior was bombed in a New Zealand harbour by the French government on direct orders from the French president himself. The New Zealand police quickly exposed the French as the perpetrators, which caused a public relations disaster for France. Eventually, the French government would pay nearly $13 million in compensation to Greenpeace. With public sympathy on the side of Greenpeace, international attention rose further on what would become one of the largest environmental organizations in the world. Today, Greenpeace has become not only one of the largest but also one of the most influential environmental interest groups. They have split efforts into many categories because there are so many issues that have been identified since the Industrial Revolution. These categories include saving oceans, stopping global warming, protecting forests, pushing for the discontinuation and disarmament of nuclear energy and weapons, eliminating toxic chemicals, and promoting sustainable agriculture. In terms of saving oceans, Greenpeace has set out several goals. 1. To make sustainable seafood the only seafood available for commercial fishing. 2. To convince governments and the UN to set aside 40% of the world's oceans as marine reserves. And 3. To ensure that the Obama administration utilizes its political leverage to stop commercial whaling. In order to stop the use of nuclear energy, Greenpeace is publicizing the myth that nuclear energy provides a green source of electricity while detailing the threats posed by nuclear reactors and the radioactive wastes they produce, exposing the abysmal economics of new nuclear power, and advocating for the permanent closure of old nuclear power plants. To stop global warming, Greenpeace plans to join local communities to shut down dirty coal plants in the U.S., to advocate strong laws to curb global warming and put America on a path to clean energy, to expose climate change deniers and hold them publicly accountable for providing millions of dollars to lobby against climate and clean energy policies, and to kickstart an energy revolution by advocating for clean energy solutions like solar and wind power. To try to detoxify human activity, Greenpeace is urging the chemical industry through the U.S. Congress to take safer alternatives in their production of chemicals to reduce the amount of lethal chemicals produced, and they are also advocating the use of clean recyclable materials as e-waste gets out of control. Finally, to promote sustainable agriculture, Greenpeace is spreading awareness of the dangers of genetically engineered agriculture and publicizing the benefits of organic foods. With Greenpeace's expansive agenda, it is clear that they are one of the most effective environmental organizations in the world. However, it is important to remember that this group of 2.9 million people around the world was incepted with the 5 people who had the initiative to stand up for what they believed.